So welcome, everybody. So today, for those of you who are new, I'm Charles Small, the director of YIISA, the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Antisemitism. So today, we're honored to have Professor Walter Reich here. Walter is the Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Professor of International Affairs, Ethics, and Human Behavior. He was appointed at George Washington University's newly endowed Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Chair in the Elliott School of International Affairs in 1998. From 1995 to 1998, he was the director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He is also a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at George Washington University, a lecturer in psychology here at Yale University, and he's also a professor of psychiatry at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. He's the author of a book entitled A Stranger in My House, Jews and Arabs in the West Bank, and the editor of The Origins of Terrorism, Psychologies, Ideologies, Theologies, States of Mind, and has written professionally for journals internationally, some of which are the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, and the New Republic. Today he's speaking, his title, I'll read you his title in a minute. It's a provocative and I think a very important title. The title is Never Again, ? When Holocaust Memory Becomes Empty Rhetoric, Diplomatic Tool, and a Weapon Against Israel. So thank you very much. It's an honor to have you, and welcome.
I have to say, it's much more an honor for me to be here. And it's an honor for me to be here because if Charles had made the error, as I just told him, of asking me, do you think there could be such an organization, an initiative set up at Yale, given the fact that you know Yale? I would say, no, don't even try. And I'm absolutely delighted that he didn't ask me. I'm absolutely delighted that he did it. And the very fact that this program exists, and the very fact that you're here, and the very fact that many, many others know about it, as a result of this marvelous thing we have called the Internet, is all thanks to Charles Small, so he's the one who deserves the applause. There's another dimension to my being here that makes me quite happy. Two of my kids, thanks, Your Excellency. Two of my children studied here. One went to that, other joined up in Cambridge. One of them was born here when I was a resident in psychiatry. And I've been here many times, and it feels very much like a home. I actually prefer the give and take of questions and answers to just reading a lecture. One of the things that Charles did was to say, look, you know, some of these lectures will end up in a book, and so it would be nice if you could prepare something written, which always freezes the heart of anybody who's busy. And I therefore sat down and did indeed write something, and will base what I say largely on that, but hope that we can go on to have questions and answers or an exchange of views. So why a lecture related to the Holocaust, which has the theme of the Holocaust or the Shoah at the center of it in a series on anti-Semitism? For some it's obvious, for others there may be questions. The Holocaust was the greatest physical outburst of anti-Semitism the Jews have ever known in a long history of such outbursts. Indeed, the Holocaust was the most striking and focused physical outburst of any ethnic hatred the world has ever known. Any aspect of the study of the Holocaust and the use and abuse of Holocaust memory has a direct bearing on the consideration of anti-Semitism in general. And it has a direct bearing on the consideration of not only ethnic hatred, but also the possibilities and uses of its memorialization. My talk today will focus on the use, often only when it's convenient, of the bold and stirring and bracing call, "Never again," in the realm of international affairs. It will also focus on the ways in which countries use Holocaust symbols to achieve diplomatic ends, and it will focus on ways in which Holocaust imagery is hurled at Israel in order to attack it and Jews, as well as the ways in which Holocaust denial, a malady that has afflicted the world for 60 years, has become in recent years wildly popular in the Arab Muslim world. And it's become even central to the domestic and the foreign policy of one country, as many of you know, probably, I'm sure all of you, Iran. That this phenomenon has taken place is well known, but was highlighted, especially during the visit by Ahmadinejad to this country. So let me first address the issue of the rhetoric and the reality of the foreign policy lessons of the Holocaust. And I put the phrase "lessons of the Holocaust" in quotes, because it's a widely used phrase, almost never defined, and almost never, and I would say never tested. Is it in reality never again, which is one of those lessons? Or is it in practice always again? And do things that are resident of the Holocaust keep on happening anyway, even though we keep on saying never again? Probably the main reason that the Holocaust is invoked regularly by leaders in connection with foreign policy matters is that it's been designated as a kind of moral touchstone in connection with such matters. Just about everyone publicly acknowledges, at least in the West, that the international community made a grave moral error in not intervening in the 1930s when Hitler promised to exterminate the Jews and then spent years squeezing them, hounding them, and finally killing them. During the 1930s, at least, countries could have intervened to stop that process, and they didn't. At the very least, they could have taken in the Jews, who, because they weren't taken in, were later murdered. As a result, everyone, at least in the West, expresses shame that no such interventions were attempted when they could still have been attempted. So when mass killings are taking place in the world, the Holocaust is sometimes cited as a justification for intervention. The problem is that the citations of the Holocaust are selective and aren't necessarily based on the degree to which the crisis in response to which intervention is being proposed is similar to the Holocaust. For example, to justify the intervention in Kosovo, President Clinton summed up the Holocaust. But he didn't do that in connection with a far more extensive and genuine genocide, one that really did reach proportions that were comparable in severity and intent, if not in numbers and methods, to the Holocaust, namely the genocide in Rwanda. To be sure, President Bush did indeed utter the motto, never again, during his visit to the Holocaust Museum in Washington in April of 2007, where he devoted most of his talk to the murders in Darfur. It's worth noting that although he didn't say that the situation in Darfur was the same as the Holocaust, the setting in which he spoke was designed to add historical gravity to his presentation. Alas, what the U.S. is actually doing in Darfur has yet to match that gravity as the killing continues to unfold. Let me be a little more specific on this matter. Let me focus on Rwanda, which is very different from Darfur. I don't want to amalgamate all of these, because each case has its own characteristics and its own analogies. So let me focus on Rwanda, and in particular on the rhetoric of never again, that our officials don't hesitate to utter when it costs nothing or little to utter it, and on the ways in which they refuse to act on that sentiment when such action is in fact seen as inconvenient or costly. So I want to focus down on the Rwanda case in dealing with this matter. In 2005, the international commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz was attended by leaders from around the world. The UN held one such commemoration. Others were held in many other countries. The vow never again was articulated by, I think, nearly all of them. Unfortunately, this vow, which has been articulated, as I've said, for decades, hasn't managed in all those decades to mobilize the actions, either national or international, that have been needed when real genocides have occurred. And Rwanda is indeed one of them. 800,000 human beings, nearly all of them Tutsis, were murdered, mostly by being hacked to death with machetes by Hutu militias. During the months this genocide unfolded, the State Department and other Clinton administration officials at the highest levels wouldn't call it a genocide. They were afraid that doing so would commit the United States, as an internal State Department memo put it, to, quote, actually do something. In the year 2000, a member of a panel established by the Organization of African Unity to study the event and the non-response to it said at a press conference, and I'm quoting here, "The United States knew exactly what was going on. I don't know how Madeleine Albright lives with it." Well, it's rare to see somebody get personal in international affairs. It's rare in rhetoric related or in statements regarding international affairs. And this guy, the Canadian, got very personal. Said, I don't know how she lives with it. Because she was, at that time, ambassador to the UN, Madeleine Albright. And she responded to that statement. And she said, and she was opposing responses to it, to genocide. Remember, this catastrophe unfolded over a period of something like 3 months. So it wasn't an overnight matter. And it was clear from near the beginning what was happening. She responded with the following phrase, which you may find resonant. She said, I was just following instructions. Secretary of State Warren Christopher, these are not bad people. Secretary of State Warren Christopher and President Clinton knew exactly what was happening, but it was in fact their unwillingness to act that set the tone for Albright's behavior. She was following instructions. In 1998, Clinton apologized in Kigali at the airport when he addressed survivors of the genocide and others for his behavior. It's worth recalling again, against the background of Clinton's inaction in the case of Rwanda, what he'd said just a year before that. Remember, this is the genocide took place in 1994, and here's what he said at the opening in March of 1993, at the opening of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, when he expressed sorrow that before World War II had started, quote, doors to liberty were shut. And it's worth noting his words at an international Holocaust conference in the year 2000, in which he said, quote, we must never forget what happened when governments turned a blind eye to grave injustice outside their borders when they waited too long to act. For his part, the Secretary of State Warren Christopher grudgingly acknowledged that what was happening in Rwanda when he was pushed to acknowledge it were, quote, acts of genocide. He was a lawyer. I'm glad we're not speaking at all here. I recall that 2 years after the Rwanda genocide, in 1996, at an exhibit mounted by the Holocaust Museum on Capitol Hill about Varian Fry, he was a brave man who, in southern France, saved about 2,000 human beings from the Holocaust, even as State Department officials tried to stop him. Christopher spoke with great feeling. I could sense that feeling because I was standing next to him as the museum's director. And he said, frankly, the conduct of our department was not our finest hour. 5 months earlier, at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial, at which he had planted a tree in honor of Varian Fry, Christopher had said that we owed Fry, quote, a promise to do whatever is necessary to ensure that such horrors never happen again. So if never again was in their hearts, why didn't Christopher, or Clinton, or Albright do what they could when they had a chance to do it to stop that particular genocide in Rwanda? They didn't do it because, unfortunately, doing so would have had a cost. No one wanted a repeat of the peacekeeping debacle that had occurred in Somalia 6 months earlier. Officials assumed that somehow things would settle down, and they focused their attention elsewhere. At the UN's commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, Kofi Annan, then the UN Secretary General, announced, quote, on occasions like this, rhetoric comes easily. He went on, we rightly say never again, but action is much harder. Since the Holocaust, the world has to its shame failed more than once to prevent or halt genocide. Close quote. Yet Annan himself, who knew all this back in 1994, responded rather weakly to that genocide. Let me turn to the problem of the fact that the Holocaust is used as a tool to promote diplomatic agendas. I've already touched on a version of that in connection with President Clinton's use of Holocaust imagery and his effort to justify a military intervention in Kosovo. But there's also another, which, by the way, was not a Holocaust, was not a genocide, in my judgment, and in the judgments of many of the people who've thought about it. But the Holocaust was quite frankly set up as a justification, referred to as justification for military intervention, I think at a time when it was, such intervention was politically possible, militarily possible, of interest, and without the downsides of other events that were much more classically genocides. But there's also another and very different way of using the Holocaust for diplomatic ends. In this other kind of use, the Holocaust is manipulated by a government in order to sway public opinion, especially opinion among Jews, by trying to show that someone whom they see as hostile to them and their interests is actually their friend, a friend who can be trusted, and that he can be trusted because he truly feels the pain of the Holocaust and therefore presumably would never harm the Jews. That's what happened in 1998 when the White House and the State Department tried to manipulate American public opinion, especially the opinion of American Jews, about the trustworthiness of Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader. They tried to do that by setting up a photo op visit by him to the Holocaust Museum. The idea was that photos of him mournfully looking at exhibits of dead Jews would make live Jews feel that he understood their pain and understood the security concerns of the Jewish state, which was created in part as a haven for Jews in the wake of the Holocaust. Seeing such photos, and perhaps seeing Arafat lay a wreath at the museum's eternal flame, which rises above a plinth containing soil from ghettos and death camps, Jews who had become increasingly dismayed by the suicide bombings that were spreading across Israel and killing scores of Israelis, and who were growing ever more convinced that Arafat wouldn't stop those bombings or had a hand even in spawning them, might reverse their distrust and come to believe that Arafat really did care about Jewish suffering and could be trusted to make a deal that would ensure a secure Israel. That invitation to Arafat was a breathtakingly and daringly manipulative act. The officials who made it were Jews on the White House's Middle East Peace Team, who were simultaneously members of the Holocaust Museum's Board of Trustees, which is known as the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. They'd been named to the council by President Clinton and also worked for him officially. And oddly enough, were named to the council as private members. There are 55 private members, people from the general public, and then there are public members who are officials, 5 named by the Senate, 5 named by the House, and I believe 3 from various departments of government. They were not from those public, they were from the private group. Probably, I have a feeling that's illegal. These officials, certainly inappropriate, these officials saw the visit as a way to advance their diplomatic agenda, which happened to be the Middle East peace process, as it's called, and one of them used his membership to convince the council's chairman to approve of the invitation, and the chairman complied. I was then the museum's director, so I need to know a little bit about this story from the inside. As soon as I learned of the invitation, I objected that it would be an exploitation of the memory of the Holocaust dead to misuse the museum for the purpose of swaying public opinion. The visit, I pointed out, would be a photo op, with the museum being used as a prop. I added that there was no evidence that Arafat wanted to understand the Holocaust. After all, he had already been invited before that to visit Yad Vashem. He was living in Gaza, a 15-minute helicopter ride away. It's an educational museum, every bit as educational as the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and he hadn't gone even though it would have been easy for him to get there. Besides, I said, this is an effort to use the Holocaust Museum as a ritual bath, known to those who understand Hebrew as a mikveh. This week it will be Arafat, so next week it will be Milosevic. Remember Milosevic? It's gone now, but at that time he wasn't gone. I was worried about not only the event itself, but also the precedent of using the Holocaust Museum as a place where people with blood in their hands could be washed. In response to my objections, Arafat was disinvited. Soon enough, pressures for a re-invitation were applied by the Clinton administration. Not only were calls made to the chairman of the museum's board, that's the one who approved of this invitation, but Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said on NBC's Meet the Press that it was, in her words, quote, too bad that the invitation had been withdrawn and that it would have been appropriate for him to visit the museum as a VIP. Following this and other political pressures, and reportedly fearful that he would lose his job, there was a lot of speculation of that at the time in the Washington Post, the chairman then re-invited Arafat, going to the Palestinian leader's hotel room to do so. After he left the hotel, he told reporters that he had invited Arafat, quote, with joy in my heart. As it happens, he failed to tell me that he would do so. At a meeting of the Holocaust Council's Executive Committee, one after another council member asked me to escort Arafat through the museum and even stand there as he would lay a wreath before the museum's eternal flame, and each time I refused. On the day that Arafat was supposed to come to the museum, though, he canceled the visit. The Monica Lewinsky scandal had broken, and Washington's press corps and photographers were at the White House covering it. The opportunity for photos and for swaying public opinion through them was gone. Soon after that, I resigned as the museum's director, writing to its board chairman that I differed with him, quote, on the use of the museum and of the memory of the Holocaust in the context of political and diplomatic circumstances or negotiations. There were some, and this is for me the most important aspect of all of this. There were some at the time of the original invitation and re-invitation, including some in the American Jewish community, and on the museum's parent body, its board of trustees, the council, who desperately wanted to believe that the visit had not been staged as a photo op, that Arafat really wanted to understand the Holocaust, and that the museum was an educational institution of such great power that Arafat would leave the building a changed man. But anyone who thinks so now, following Arafat's pullout from the visit, when it was clear that photographers wouldn't be there to cover it, following his failure to respond to Yad Vashem's invitations, which, by the way, flowed out immediately after this event, during the event as it was unfolding yet again, and following repeated denials in Palestinian Authority publications that the Holocaust ever happened, is simply reinventing history for polemical reasons. Interestingly, last year, the head of the PLO mission to the United States, there is a PLO mission, by the way, to the United States, Afif Safia, actually argued in a letter to the Washington Post that Arafat had a, quote, strong desire, close quote, to visit the museum. Maybe enough time had passed that he thought everyone forgot what happened, and that he could revise the tortured history of this episode, manipulating the Holocaust to serve his own needs. Who knows? Maybe he actually believes that that's how it happened. Clearly, it's important to remember what really did happen, not only to protect the integrity of history, but also to recall how even those who are entrusted with the task of preserving Holocaust memory can use that memory to advance political and diplomatic ends. Let me address now one other theme, which is the promotion of Holocaust memory as a means to demonstrate that one isn't against Israel, or that anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. On several occasions, the promotion of Holocaust memory has been used for this purpose. When in the late 1970s, just to focus on two cases, very, very briefly, President Jimmy Carter got into trouble with the American Jewish community because he sold weapons systems to Saudi Arabia, F-15s, AWACS, systems that could be used against the Jewish state. His advisors suggested that he establish a commission to study ways of commemorating the Holocaust. Establishing such a commission would, they felt, mollify the anger toward him among some American Jews, many. In fact, that was the origin of the United States Holocaust Memorial Commission, which eventually recommended the creation of a permanent United States Holocaust Memorial Council, as well as the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Annual Days of Remembrance. It turns out that Jimmy Carter didn't seem pleased by this outcome. Moreover, how all this happened is a long story, and it's been documented by others. Anyone wants to read more about it can read, for example, Linenthal's Preserving Memory, in which is covered to some extent. What's relevant to the theme of this lecture, though, is that what some might consider to have been a great act of memory was, one could argue, fundamentally a great act, or maybe a small act, of politics. Interestingly, at a White House reception for rabbis, that was called to celebrate the creation of a Holocaust remembrance body, one of those rabbis, who happens to have been my brother-in-law, when he reached Carter on the receiving line, went to the political heart of the matter by saying to him, Mr. President, don't give us the Holocaust at the expense of Israel. I think he was prescient back in 1978. Carter was not amused, I can report to you. And in a current case, separate case, the United Nations, which has been identified repeatedly as being rapidly and obsessively anti-Israel, has sponsored Holocaust commemorations, and they've also sponsored a Holocaust exhibition. Apparently they're planning yet another one. Many, including some Holocaust survivors, have been pleased by the recognition on the part of the UN of Holocaust memory. Others, who are more wary of that organization, have suspected, at least to some extent, that such commemorations and exhibitions, which have been far less prominent than have been the organization's unrelenting attacks against Israel, have been mounted primarily to demonstrate that even if the organization is anti-Zionist, it isn't anti-Semitic. Critics of the UN's behavior toward Israel have noted that it costs little to commemorate dead Jews, but it's potentially deadly to demonize, castigate, and excoriate the Jewish state. And let me focus now on the use of the Holocaust epithet as a weapon against the country of the victims of the Holocaust, namely Israel. We know, of course, that there's a massive Holocaust denial industry in the Arab and Muslim world. After all, Israel is seen as a product of that Holocaust as having been created on the basis of the justification of the Jews. In the wake of the Holocaust, needed a homeland in which they could defend themselves. What easier way is there to undercut that justification, especially if you want to end that existence, than by denying that the Holocaust ever happened? That it was invented by the Jews in order to steal Muslim and Arab land. Everyone here in this room knows the claims by Ahmadinejad that the Holocaust was a myth, but I could spend hours, I won't, reading to you similar claims by Muslim clerics and leaders saying the same thing. Ironically, though, even as many Muslim figures insist that the Holocaust never happened, many others, together with their supporters in the West, find it convenient to hurl the epithet Nazi at Israel because of the excoriating power of that term. For example, former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon was regularly called a Nazi mass murderer in the Palestinian and other Arab and Muslim press. And on a recent Palestinian TV program, a children's play was shown depicting Israelis, quote, who did the Holocaust, close quote, by burning Palestinian children in ovens. They don't seem to get this idea that actually what happened was Jews were gassed and burned only after they were dead. But the epithet Nazi and Nazi imagery are also regularly hurled at Israel by European newspapers, editorialists, cartoonists, prominent writers. Many of these examples of this are well known. In 2001, the Spanish newspaper El País published a cartoon showing a small figure carrying a rectangular mustache flying toward Sharon's upper lip. The caption read, "Cleo, the muse of history, puts Hitler's mustache on Ariel Sharon." 2 days later, another Spanish newspaper, La Vanguardia, printed a cartoon showing a building with a sign that read, quote, "Museum of the Jewish Holocaust." Next to that building was another one still being built with a sign, "Future Museum of the Palestinian Holocaust." In June of 2001, 3 days after a Palestinian suicide bomber killed 21 Israelis at a disco and wounded 100 others, yet another Spanish daily published a cartoon depicting Ariel Sharon with a hook nose and sporting a swastika with a Star of David, saying, quote, "At least Hitler taught me how to invade a country and destroy every living insect." And I can go on and on. Quotes from cartoons, from famous writers, from a Nobel Prize winner, comparing Ramallah to the Warsaw Ghetto, Jenin to the Holocaust. Actually, it was Jenin that was compared to the Warsaw Ghetto. From all over Europe. And the animus toward Israel in Europe is growing ever stronger, with the Nazi epithet being hurled there with particular venom and frequency during the recent war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Why is the Nazi epithet used against Israel? It's used because it's effective. And it's effective with Israel because it instantly and ingeniously and effectively turns what are usually seen as history's victims, those who burden everyone by asking them to remember the Holocaust, into history's persecutors, especially if that alleged persecution is used to justify the existence of a country that is seen as having caused the victimization of others. Finally, I want to address Holocaust denial as ideology, as strategy, and as an instrument of foreign policy. Ironically, but inevitably, even as the claim is being made that the current-day Holocaust is being carried out by the Israelis, the claim is also being made in the same countries that the Holocaust never happened, and it's on this theme that I'd like to end the talk. The most active current arena for Holocaust denial is, of course, Iran, and the president of Iran has made questioning the Holocaust a pillar of his presidency, even as a mini-series has been presented on Iranian TV about an Iranian diplomat who rescued Jews in France during the Holocaust. It's illogical, but never mind logic. The claim that the Holocaust never happened has been made throughout the 60 years since the Holocaust ended, both in Europe and the US. It's been made by anti-Semites who wanted to accomplish two things. First, they wanted to discredit the fact that that has most discredited anti-Semitism, that it can lead to the mass murder of Jews. For 60 years, the Holocaust gave anti-Semitism a bad name. They wanted to erase that bad name by trying to convince the public that the Holocaust was a big lie. And they wanted to do that so that it would be acceptable once again to be anti-Semitic. In addition, the Holocaust deniers have wanted to discredit the Jews. Not only are the Jews evil people, they're evil people who made up tall tales in order to extort things from the world. What do they want to extort? Sympathy, money in the form of Holocaust reparations, and legitimacy for the State of Israel. As I've said until recently, most of this took place in Europe, but the arena where it's taking place most actively now is in the Arab Muslim world. I don't need to rehearse for you. I think most of you probably know many of the details of this. I'll just touch on a few examples. For a number of years, anti-Semitic screeds, movies, and cartoons have been a staple in Arab and Iranian media. A forgery claiming a Jewish plot to take over the world, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, as well as Hitler's Mein Kampf, are commonly sold in bookstores across the Middle East. TV shows beam to millions, show Canadian Jews murdering non-Jewish children so that they can use their blood in baking matzahs. Jews are portrayed as poisoning Arab children, spreading AIDS, and even piloting the airlines that destroyed the World Trade Center. The newspapers and TV channels in which much of this anti-Semitic material appears include those owned by governments, even the government of Egypt, which maintains a peace, a cold peace, still a peace with Israel. Anti-Semitism has become increasingly virulent. Not only are Jews accused of being evil, increasingly arguments are being made that they should be killed. Anti-Semitism in the Arab Muslim world is becoming ever more commonly eliminations. At the same time, the media in Arab countries and in Iran have focused ever more on Holocaust denial. At first, the most common Holocaust-related theme in the Muslim world was the position that the world must be grateful for Hitler's achievement in ridding Europe of its Jews. In the Egyptian government newspaper Al-Akhbar, for example, the columnist Ahmed Ragab wrote, "Give thanks to Hitler. He took revenge on the Israelis in advance on behalf of the Palestinians. Our one complaint against him was that his revenge was not complete enough." Increasingly, however, the tack has become that Hitler didn't finish the job, but that he never started it. That was heard as far back as the 1970s, but it's become especially common in recent years as Holocaust denial has become especially prevalent. I won't give you the examples that I have here in my paper of this. There are legions of them. Again and again, there are statements that never happened. And the pace of these statements, the pace of Holocaust denial, increased markedly during the past few years in Iran. And nothing in what Ahmadinejad said during his visit to the UN and to New York in last month has taken any of that back. In fact, the story that Ahmadinejad is trying to sell is clear. The Holocaust is a story that was invented by Jews in order to make Westerners, and especially Europeans, feel guilty so that they would give the Jews both money and a country. Europeans who controlled the Middle East believed the story, and to expiate their false guilt, gave them that money in the form of reparations and created Israel, where Jews, according to this belief, had never lived. In the process, it was stolen from the Palestinians, who as a result have experienced a real Holocaust. It's now necessary to show that the Holocaust never happened, and that will justify eliminating it, not the Holocaust, but Israel itself. Given the mountain of evidence, the Holocaust happened exactly as most of us in the world know it happened, and that 6 million Jews were murdered in it, Ahmadinejad's belief seems absurd, but it's also dangerous. This is the same Ahmadinejad whose government is building nuclear installations that are clearly aimed at creating nuclear weapons. Anybody who actually believes that he wants to create something, create them for the purpose of having an energy source instead of oil, that person got a degree in international affairs with that act revoked. This is the same Ahmadinejad who has assured the true believers that not only will Israel be destroyed, but that the Muslim world will destroy it. It's distressing to end this presentation on so chilling and depressing a note. But the most chilling dimension of all this is that this prospect, the prospect that in fact this project of Ahmadinejad's and actually Rafsanjani's, another leader in Iran, could really be successful. And there could really be another Holocaust. There are 6 million Jews currently living in Israel. As I said at the outset, any aspect of the study of the Holocaust and the use and abuse of Holocaust memory is a direct bearing on the consideration of anti-Semitism in general, which is, after all, the theme of this program. So let me just summarize what I've addressed. I've discussed how the Holocaust, an event that Jews hope at least has lessons that can be taught, is an event whose most bracing lesson, never again, has been piously cited by foreign policymakers, but sadly, when that lesson has really been applicable, has been rarely observed. I've discussed how the symbols and memory of the Holocaust have been misused as a prop to pursue diplomatic ends, illuminating the vulnerability of Holocaust memory to abuse. I've discussed how Holocaust commemorations have served to deflect the criticism that a government or an international organization is harming Israel or is actually anti-Semitic. I've discussed how references to the Holocaust have become a weapon to be used by anti-Semites against the very state that rose out of its ashes. And finally, I've discussed the Holocaust as an event that's being denied by the president of one country who is racing to create the weapons that in a terrible nightmare that one could easily envision could result in yet another Holocaust. I'll stop after this not altogether happy litany of the misuses of Holocaust memory in political and international affairs, and would be happy, grateful for any questions, any comments, any disagreements, or any implications that you may have. Thanks.
Thank you very much for a very important, very sobering presentation. I'll start with the questions. I wanted to ask you, I was reminded of the expression that denial ain't just a Holocaust, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. But my question is, given, I think, the political culture in the United States, I'm speaking, I guess, as somebody who studies social sciences, but also as a person who's not from the United States, a foreigner. There are other democracies in the Western world that deal with issues of freedom of speech in a different manner, even though they're still, by all accounts, full-fledged democracies. So, for example, in Canada, there's notions of hate speech. There's freedoms of expression, there's freedom of speech, but there's also freedom from speech. That nobody has the right to incite, nobody has the right to incite violence, particularly against identifiable groups. So, given the American foreign policy during the disintegration of former Yugoslavia, Bosnia, and Rwanda, and the documentation that you presented today, which is very chilling. And I think if you sort of fast forward to the debate that emerged in the last month with Ahmadinejad, and how I think intellectuals and the media, the highbrow media in the United States was fixated on this notion of freedom of expression and freedom of speech. Right. When there's international law, which clearly stipulates there's the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. Article 3 clearly stipulates that it's against the convention, it's a punishable offense for people to engage in incitement leading to genocide. And that people should be given a fair due process, they should be brought to a tribunal, and given, arrested, brought to a tribunal, and given a fair trial. So here is somebody clearly inciting genocide, clearly, and unequivocally for the past several years. And it's done from a worldview which I don't think people quite comprehend. And I find it fascinating. Maybe you can touch on it in terms of international relations, but also from your background in psychiatry. When Ahmadinejad was at Columbia, he mentioned that there's no gay people in Iran. The entire audience, I think, very naturally reacted. They laughed and they were aghast, and rightfully so. And I think, in a sense, it's consistent with an Islamicist worldview that this just doesn't happen in a proper Islamic society. And yet, when it comes to anti-Semitism, to the annihilation of Jews, to the removal of Israel, people seem incapacitated to even gasp. Why?
Wow. After every sentence of your question, your statement, I don't know what to call it, I had an answer, and then I had to put it off until the next question. And I had another answer. I love that comment about denial isn't just from Egypt. Actually, in classic psychoanalysis, it's also considered a mechanism of defense, and it's used in a variety of ways. The issue of, you raised a huge number of questions, and I understand that the real question, the most important question, which I'll get to in a second, has to do with, given this impetus on the part of Iran's open impetus to eliminate Israel, why isn't there a justification here for responding to it using legal means, using already existing charters, international agreements, using whatever mechanism, formal or informal, that can be summoned up, and I would support any and all of those. Because I think the threat is real, I think the threat is great, and I think that it is one of the many threats that face the very existence of the state, but it's the most immediate one. There are others that are almost immediate, but this is the most, I believe, the most immediate. A death by 1,000 Katyushas is one kind of threat. This is a, death by a single bomb. And we have to take it extremely seriously, and it isn't just a threat against Israel, it's a threat against not only the entire region, given the proliferation of missile technology, it's a threat against Europe, it could well be even a threat against the United States. But I'll get back to that. Don't take that as I was, like you, struck by the reception about the job at Columbia. I was struck by the rationales that were offered, by the arguments that were raised, by the justifications that were given for his presentation. And I was personally struck because I remembered that when I was an undergraduate at Columbia, in the 1960s, and a graduate student, I remember who was, believe it or not, I studied philosophy at Columbia. I remember that there was a student group that invited George Lincoln Rockwell to speak there. And George Lincoln Rockwell, for those of you who were born, who are not of a certain age, should know that George Lincoln Rockwell was the head of the American Nazi Party during the 1960s, would strut around in a brown uniform and wanted to finish the job that Hitler had started. And some group, it was called Humanitas actually, student group, invited him to speak. And I was then, as I am now, very much in favor of free speech. But I just wanted to know what they were thinking. And I asked for a meeting with the head of this group and one of the deans. There was a professor who came, I came, and I turned to this guy, the head of the group, and I said, what were you thinking? There are a million kooks in America. There are all kinds of people you could have invited. If you wanted to create a ruckus, you could have invited somebody else. Why did you invite some? You have a right to invite him, nobody's disputing that, but why did you choose to do so? And his only answer was freedom of speech. I think there's a difference between freedom of speech and foolishness of invitation. And every time there is an invitation, one is not obliged to invite everybody. If you were obliged, if every university were obliged to invite everybody at all times, universities would be filled with, all their classrooms would be filled with speakers with no audiences, listening to people ranting about this or that. To be sure, Rafsanjani was the head of state of a particular country with a very, shall we say, controversial position. Still, Columbia was not obliged. And when the invitation came in, Bollinger, the president of Columbia, was asked to pass on there was an inquiry. And he was asked to pass on it, and he approved, and therefore he, in the name of Columbia, invited him, so he was invited. I think that was a mistake that was not erased by the comments that Bollinger made. And I was strongly opposed to it. And in fact, believe that it was analogous, his visit, not to Columbia, but to the World Trade Center site, which he tried to do, was analogous to the Arafat visit, or non-visit, to the Holocaust Museum. And that what he wanted to do was improve his image. And it would have been a photo op to improve his image in the United States. See, I'm laying the wreath in this hallowed place. Just to go back to the Broken Rockwell visit for a second, to show sort of the kind of farce it was. On the day he was supposed to come, sort of like Monica Lewinsky, the day he was supposed to come, he didn't show up. There were people, students marching around with signs saying, "We don't want us." Remember, this is before the 1968 riots when people became highly politicized. Just before that, a year or two before that, people walking around with signs saying, protesting the visit of Norman Rockwell. It was a farce. And he didn't come. But focusing on the non-farcical aspects of it, I really do believe that people like Ahmadinejad, who have their power because they achieve it within their states, and therefore they have power. They simply have power. He is the president of his country. He's not the supreme leader. So we all know the actual leader, the supreme leader, is somebody who's not democratically elected. But he is the highest elected government official in the country. And he speaks for his country, and he has a vast executive power. There are countercurrents within the country, but there are countercurrents in every country. We sort of fasten upon those countercurrents and hope that they're going to win, but hope is not a substitute for reality. Ultimately, he and the supreme leader and others in his party will have their fingers on the trigger of something that they're trying to create. I do think that there is a role, a justification for pursuing any means possible to bring him before some sort of court. The reality is that it won't do much good, I think, but in practical terms. But I think in moral and political terms, it will do good. And those terms are pretty important. And I support what I believe to be your idea of doing so. It's my very long answer to your almost small question.
Walter, I love listening to you. I could listen to you forever, and I'm happy to talk this too. But the question I had is, to what extent do you see, from the perspective, what happened in Turkey with the Armenians a century ago as a precursor or a model of genocide or the Holocaust? And if you see any parallels, then to what extent do you see the current dance with Turkey by the U.S., by Israel, for a while by the ADL, to try and make nice to Turkey as interacting with the concept of Holocaust minimization and denial? Thanks, Dan.
I just want you to know that Dan is a co-author of a book that we and two other shrinks wrote. When we found ourselves in Heidelberg, all jet lagged, and Dan was about to give a talk on the neurobiology of diurnal rhythms and the stuff that goes on in the brain, that part of which results in jet lag. And I said, Dan, you want to write a book on this? He said, no, I won't write it without you. But he was then at the NIH. I guess I was as well. And it ended up in the usual NIH manner, which is your lab chief then collaborates, and your lab chief's lab chief then collaborates. So 4 shrinks ended up writing a book that was shrink wrap because it contained an eye mask which was necessary to control the production of melatonin. I know you didn't want me to bring this up, but it's true.
It was better than playing poker.
Better than playing poker. We wrote it real fast, didn't we? The Armenian Turkish example, which we are going through right now, is in fact constitutes 3 pages of this thing that I wrote that I didn't touch upon, and it's quite apt, I think, because it's an example of politics trumping history. In this case, many decades old history, politics trumping memory. In the end, as anybody who's been reading the papers knows, the House committee, the relevant House committee, passed a resolution condemning the Armenian genocide, and it was all set to pass the House. It had many, many co-sponsors enough to pass it, and then Turkey said, if you pass it, goodbye to the use of Rhetoric air base in southern and eastern Turkey, through which 75% of our war effort material goes on its way to Iraq. And pretty soon, even co-sponsors said this ain't going to pass. Not because of historical reality, but because of political realities. I have a wonderful quote here from John Murtha, who said, if I can find it, just a couple of days ago, he said, he urged the speaker to keep the resolution from the floor. Quote, the point is, we have to deal with today's world. So the act of ignoring the so-called post-Holocaust lesson of never again, though it's most pernicious with regard to ongoing new genocides, also has a retroactive dimension to it. Not as important, because nobody knew it was being killed, but it is important to the Armenian community. And so I do think it is resonant. I do think it is important. Plays a role here. Thanks, Dan.
In reference to your last answer, you talked about taking Ahmadinejad in front of court. I mean, what I'm trying to wrap my head around that issue. I mean, how would that be? Where's the court?
I think this is a gentleman who can answer that.
Just very briefly, the UN Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, it spells out the process to arrest somebody who's guilty of genocide or also people who are inciting genocide. There's a whole process that the UN is supposed to enforce. And countries that sign this convention, which the United States and almost every nation that belongs to the UN has signed, they're supposed to actually they're responsible for arresting people who do this. There's a whole process that actually exists.
But
I don't want to get off this subject.
He was treated as a visiting dignitary, and you're saying we should have just put him in a lockup.
Yes, according to the UN and then international law,
We could have.
It should be.
Actually, what is being alluded to here is really not so much denial of the Holocaust, because denial implies a certain energy, fighting an idea. I'm more concerned about the issue of apathy. That 60 years after the Holocaust, what happens to any event is it gets stripped of its emotional connection. And I'm not even so concerned even for the outside world, but even among Jews. And one of the questions that I had was, how does one then transmit this as an emotional, powerful lesson? And Jews do this with the destruction of the temple they set up day of Tisha B'Av, so that some way you artificially create a mourning. But the Holocaust isn't even wrapped into that. Or if it is, it's done in such a minimal way. So there's a concern that not only the non-Jews will begin to forget the Holocaust, but Jews will see it as a little piece of history that has taken place. And not the emotion, when you say it and I say it, we have an emotional connection to it because we remember. 2 generations later, people don't remember anything. They just read about it twice and they heard it in the Hebrew school class. So why get so worked up about it is what most people think. So one of the questions is, how does one educate in an emotional sense both Jews and non-Jews?
So just a great question. It is a great question. It's a massively important question. And it's a question, as you say, focused largely or most directly on the Jewish community. There is a phrase that's been from time to time used during the past few years, which is a little chilling, but actually, I think, in many arenas, quite accurate, which is, that phrase is Holocaust fatigue. People are tired. For a couple of decades, 3 or so, nobody wanted to talk about the Holocaust, including Jews, for reasons that we don't have time to get into here, and that are in many cases speculative. And then there was the Holocaust miniseries that appeared on television in the 70s, and then the great growth of interest in it. Holocaust survivors started talking, people started focusing on it. Eventually, Jimmy Carter was persuaded that Jews would stop being mad if he created these councils and museum, kicking and screaming as he was. It's an interesting, this is an aside, piece of paper in the National Archives. And I hope I remember this correctly, but this is a marginalia in Carter's handwriting, in which he writes this proposal to name various members to the Holocaust, I think it was council, and they were Jews. And he said, and he wanted Ukrainians and Latvians. He said, more Euro-ethnics, more democratic voters. There was a spurt, a massive growth actually, of interest in the Holocaust, resulting in the Holocaust Museum, and a couple of million people go there every year and do learn some important things in visiting that place. But recently, it's been said that there's been sort of Holocaust fatigue. New York Times publishes less and less on the subject. New York Times Book Review reviews less and less on the subject. I don't think it's accidental. Within the Jewish community, there have been a number of voices, especially rabbinical voices, that have said that the Shoah is at the least as important, if not more important. And personally, I think it's more important within Jewish history than anything that happened in Jewish history, including the destruction of the 2 temples, and possibly even the memory or centrality of the Exodus itself. And yet, we have in the Jewish tradition rituals that evoke very clearly and repeatedly those events, but nothing except for some synagogues saying a prayer in memory of the Shoah dead during the YIISGAP. So a number of rabbinical authorities have said, let's put in some kind of ritual. And I must say, that it has not taken so far. And I must say also that I'm inclined to fear that over the decades, the Holocaust, which was after all the worst pogrom, that one can call it that, that the Jews ever experienced, will become yet another bad pogrom, but will receive, to some extent, an importance compared with the role it plays now in our lives. I say this sadly, but I agree with you.
I have two questions. The first one is, why do institutions like Columbia University and other Ivy League colleges invite people like Ahmadinejad or the infamous Rockwell? And when I doubt that they would invite an obvious coup from the white supremacists or somebody from the Ku Klux Klan, why do they provide someone like a platform to legitimize his belief system or his intentions? And my second question is, again, connected to Ahmadinejad. How do you explain that contemporary Germany is the largest trading partner with Iran and was during the Nazi regime very close with Iran? And even though contemporary Germany claims to be a friend of Israel, it is an ally of the United States.
First of all, the second part of your question, when countries do business with other countries, usually it's business that rules their behavior. And unless there are strong enough reasons of a different nature to stop that kind of business, it continues. So if it's good business, it obviously is good business to be with a country that has such second largest proven oil reserves in the world, I believe. Then you do business with it. And there are not enough stops to stop that. The question of why Ahmadinejad was chosen, was asked, was invited, whereas others are not, who advocate similarly despicable positions, is a question related to the large question of, I think, to some extent, the nature of an ethos that exists on American campuses. And it's very, very complex. We all know that somebody who advocates the despicable view that, let's say, an entire group, not Jews, or not Israel, should be eradicated, would never get a hearing on an American campus. The week, I think it was the week before Ahmadinejad was turned down, yet another person was turned down in Columbia. I mean, the week before Ahmadinejad came to Columbia, another person was turned down, was disinvited, who was a member of this Minuteman project that advocates building a fence across the southern border of the United States with Mexico. And in California, at UC Davis, Lawrence Summers, former president of Harvard, who was, as everybody here probably knows, dismissed. It's quite exciting. Dismissed, forced to resign because he expressed certain views that were considered anti-female, anti-woman. was actually disinvited from UC Davis when professors rose in protest. So there are certain kinds of people who are not who are disinvited or not invited, and there are certain kinds of people for whom the sanctions against inviting don't hold. And it's a large question having to do, I think, with the culture of American campuses and American political discussion, especially on campuses. And more than that, I don't think this is a place to discuss that.
One more.
I'm just curious, and you're mentioning about the Holocaust Museum and our fact that we invited. Were Madeline Albright, Dennis Ross, and Aaron Miller behind the pressure that happened?
Yes, yes, and yes.
3 Jews.
Yeah, I remember probably after the fact, but yes. Which order did you mention that?
Madeline Albright, Dennis Ross, and Aaron Miller.
Yeah, in reverse order, that was
Sure.
the...
Is Aaron Miller on the board?
Yes, on the executive committee. Both of them are on the board.
So on behalf of YIISA, thank you very much for coming.
Hello, Mr. Warren.
Anybody who wants, we have some handouts for our next lectures. The next seminar is in 2 weeks at 7 p.m. Hillel Neuer is the director of UN Watch in Geneva.